Dublin, Ireland. March 14, 1838. When maintenance worker Thomas Brennan descended into the storage cellar beneath the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital, he expected to find the source of the overwhelming stench that had been seeping through the floorboards for weeks. What he discovered instead would expose one of the darkest chapters in Irish institutional history. In the dim gaslight, Brennan stood frozen. Before him, dozens of feral cats scattered like shadows, hissing and spitting as they abandoned their feast. But these animals weren't feeding on rats or spoiled food. They were gorging on the decomposing remains of infants, tiny bodies stacked like cordwood, some partially mummified, others so fresh the flesh still clung to fragile bones. The cats had been living in this charnel house for months, perhaps years, but the truth was far more terrifying than a simple case of improper burial. Because these children hadn't died from disease or accident. They had been systematically neglected, starved, and left to perish in one of the institutions meant to protect them. And the cats? They had simply followed the scent of death that the hospital's administrators had been trying to hide. Before we uncover the truth about the Dublin Foundling Hospital cats and the horrific negligence exposed by animal behavior, make sure to subscribe to Fear Sermon and ring that notification bell. We bring you the forgotten horrors and dark mysteries that history tried to bury. Drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from. We love hearing from our community of mystery seekers. Now, let's descend into one of the most disturbing institutional scandals of 19th century Ireland. The year is 1830, and Ireland stands at a crossroads between Old World desperation and New World industrial callousness. The Great Famine still lies years in the future, but poverty already grips the Irish people with merciless fingers. In Dublin, the capital city swells with displaced families fleeing rural destitution. The streets teem with beggars, prostitutes, and abandoned children. Typhus and cholera make regular appearances in the overcrowded tenements of the Liberties and along the Liffey's fetid banks. Into this world of suffering, the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital presents itself as a beacon of Christian charity. Established under the Irish poor law system, the institution occupies a imposing Georgian building on the north side of the city, its limestone facade suggesting respectability and order. The hospital operates under the authority of the Board of Guardians, wealthy Protestant gentlemen who rarely set foot in the facility itself, preferring to review ledgers and approve budgets from the comfort of their offices. The hospital's stated mission is simple: to care for abandoned infants and foundlings, children left at workhouse doors, born to unmarried mothers, or orphaned by disease. In the 1830s, such institutions exist throughout Britain and Ireland, a response to the social crisis of illegitimacy and poverty. The prevailing philosophy holds that institutional care, however harsh, is preferable to allowing children to die in gutters or at the hands of desperate mothers. But institutional care operates on a peculiar economy. The foundling hospitals receive a fixed allowance per child from parish authorities, a system that creates a perverse incentive. The less money spent on each child's care, the more remains for administrators' salaries and operational expenses. It is a business model built on human misery, and it attracts a particular type of administrator, those who view charity as a profitable enterprise. At the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital, that administrator is Mrs. Catherine Hogan, a widow of 53 with a reputation for efficiency. Mrs. Hogan runs the institution with an iron fist, employing a staff of nurses and wet nurses drawn from the city's poorest classes, women desperate enough to accept meager wages and turn blind eyes to uncomfortable truths. The building itself is a warren of wards, nurseries, and storage rooms. The main floor houses the receiving area where infants are admitted, often anonymously, sometimes with small tokens or notes pinned to their swaddling. Above are the nurseries, rooms lined with wooden cradles where dozens of infants lie in various states of care. Below, in the cellars, are the storage rooms, coal bunkers, and utility spaces that form the hospital's hidden infrastructure. It is a world designed to operate out of public view. Donors and board members see only the clean receiving areas and are assured that their charitable contributions are saving innocent souls. The nurses and workers, sworn to discretion and dependent on their positions, learn not to ask questions. And the infants themselves, too young to speak and often too sick to cry, have no voice at all. By 1835, troubling rumors begin to circulate through Dublin's working-class neighborhoods. Women who have placed children at the Foundling Hospital whisper that something isn't right. A mother who visits to check on her illegitimate child is turned away, told the infant died of fever, but she swears she heard her baby crying from an upper window. A wet nurse dismissed for drunkenness tells wild stories about the cellar, but she's easily dismissed as a disgruntled drunk, seeking revenge. The cats appear around this time. At first, just a few strays lurking in the alleys around the building. Then more. Within months, dozens of feral cats make the Foundling Hospital their territory, multiplying with the rapid fecundity of their species. They slip through broken basement windows, nest in the coal stores, and emerge at night like shadows. The neighbors notice. How could they not? But cats in Dublin are as common as rain. And if the Foundling Hospital has an infestation, well, buildings in poor neighborhoods always have rats. The cats are simply doing nature's work. What no one realizes is that these cats have discovered something far more abundant than rats. The first official complaint reaches the Board of Guardians in October 1835. Dr. James Cusack, a physician with a private practice on Rutland Square, has been called to examine a foundling placed with a respectable family for fostering. The child, a boy of approximately 18 months, is severely malnourished despite allegedly receiving institutional care for over a year. Dr. Cusack's report is clinical and damning. The child exhibits signs of prolonged starvation, with wasted musculature, distended abdomen consistent with parasitic infection, and evidence of rickets suggesting profound neglect. No child receiving adequate nutrition could present in such condition. The board responds with a perfunctory investigation. Mrs. Hogan provides detailed ledgers showing proper expenditures on milk, bread, and coal. She explains that the child was sickly from birth and resistant to feeding, a common enough claim in an era when infant mortality hovers near 50% in institutional settings. The board accepts her explanation. Dr. Cusack is thanked for his diligence and politely ignored. But Dr. Cusack isn't alone in his suspicions. In January 1836, a fire breaks out in a neighboring building. The Dublin Fire Brigade responds, and in the chaos of fighting the flames, several firemen enter the Foundling Hospital's yard, seeking water access. One of them, a man named Patrick O'Malley, later reports to his captain that he observed an unnatural quantity of cats around the hospital's cellar windows and that the smell emanating from the building was reminiscent of a battlefield 3 days after engagement. O'Malley's captain files no formal report. The smell could be explained by overflowing privies or inadequate sewerage, common problems in institutional buildings. Her testimony is attributed to hysteria, that catch-all diagnosis used to dismiss women's claims throughout the Victorian era. Mary Doolan dies 3 weeks later, her stories dismissed as the ravings of a disturbed mind. Through 1836 and 1837, the pattern intensifies. The mortality rate at the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital climbs steadily, but not dramatically enough to trigger immediate alarm. After all, foundling hospitals are death traps by nature, places where the weakest infants end up, born to malnourished mothers, often already sick when admitted. A mortality rate of 60 or even 70% raises eyebrows, but not necessarily investigations. What does raise questions is the discrepancy in burial records. Father Michael Brennan, a Catholic priest serving several Dublin parishes, begins to notice an oddity in 1837. The Foundling Hospital reports regular deaths and requests burial services, but the number of infant coffins brought to the parish graveyard seems inconsistent with the reported death toll. When he inquires about this discrepancy, he's told that many infants are buried in the hospital's own consecrated ground, a small cemetery plot behind the building, maintained at the institution's expense to save parish burial costs. Father Brennan requests to perform services at this cemetery. Mrs. Hogan politely but firmly refuses, citing concerns about disease and the unseemliness of drawing public attention to the high mortality rate. She assures him that a Protestant chaplain conducts regular services for all infants, regardless of denomination. This is technically improper. Catholic children should receive Catholic burial rites, but it's far from the worst religious impropriety of the era. Father Brennan makes a note in his records and moves on to more pressing concerns. The cats, meanwhile, continue to multiply. By the summer of 1837, the infestation has become impossible to ignore. Dozens of feral cats prowl the hospital grounds day and night. They're well-fed, glossy-coated animals, unusual for street cats in Dublin's poor neighborhoods, where feral animals typically appear mangy and half-starved. These cats are thriving. Neighbors complain about the noise, the yowling courtship of toms, the hissing territorial disputes, the midnight cacophony of feline society. Mrs. Hogan hires a rat catcher to poison some of the animals, but the population barely decreases. For every cat that dies from poisoned meat, 3 more seem to appear, drawn by whatever abundant food source sustains them. In November 1837, a scandal erupts at a similar institution in Cork. The Cork Foundling Hospital is investigated after a nurse comes forward with allegations of systematic neglect. The investigation reveals horrific conditions: starving infants left unattended for days, mortality rates approaching 80%, and financial records suggesting that funds meant for childcare have been diverted to administrators' pockets. The director is arrested, the institution shuttered, and the surviving children transferred to other facilities. The scandal makes headlines in the Dublin papers. The Board of Guardians, suddenly concerned about their own institutional liabilities, announces a review of all foundling hospitals under their authority. Mrs. Hogan is given advance notice of an inspection scheduled for December. The inspection, when it occurs, finds nothing amiss. The nurseries are clean, the children who are presented appear reasonably cared for, and the financial records are immaculate. Mrs. Hogan has had weeks to prepare, and she is a woman of considerable organizational skill. The inspectors spend 4 hours at the facility, never venturing into the cellars, never counting the actual number of children against the admission records, never questioning why so many cats surround a building supposedly overrun with rats. The Board of Guardians publishes a report praising the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital as a model of efficient charitable care. But efficiency in this context has a terrible meaning. Through the winter of 1837-1838, a brutal season even by Irish standards, the smell from the Foundling Hospital intensifies. It seeps through floorboards, emanates from cellar windows, and lingers in the surrounding streets like an invisible fog. Neighbors complain to parish authorities, who relay the complaints to the Board of Guardians, who instruct Mrs. Hogan to improve ventilation and sanitization. Mrs. Hogan implements a solution. She orders the cellar windows sealed with boards and mortar, trapping the smell inside. The cats, deprived of their easy entrance, begin to gather at a broken window on the building's north side, a basement window with a damaged frame that allows them to squeeze through. Night after night, they disappear into this entrance and emerge hours later, satiated and grooming their whiskers. It is this window that Thomas Brennan investigates on March 14, 1838. If this story is giving you chills, hit that like button and share this with someone who loves dark mysteries. What we're about to uncover gets even more disturbing, and you'll want to hear every detail. Let's discover what happens next when Thomas Brennan enters that cellar. Thomas Brennan is not a man prone to hysteria. At 43, he has worked maintenance in Dublin's poorest districts for 2 decades. He has cleaned cesspits, hauled corpses during cholera outbreaks, and dealt with the worst effluvia of urban poverty. He considers himself beyond shock. But when he descends, the stone steps into the Foundling Hospital's western cellar, carrying a lantern and expecting to find blocked drainage or rotting supplies, what he encounters will haunt him for the remainder of his life. The cats flee from his lantern light, at least 30 of them, scattering into the shadows like liquid darkness. The smell hits him with physical force, the sweet rotten odor of decomposition mixed with the acrid stench of cat urine and the metallic undertone of old blood. Brennan gags, covers his mouth with his handkerchief, and forces himself forward. The cellar is large, perhaps 30 feet by 20, with a low ceiling supported by brick pillars. It should contain coal, stored vegetables, and institutional supplies. Instead, in the wavering lantern light, Brennan sees what he will later describe as a vision of hell itself. Bodies, dozens of infant bodies. Some are stacked against the far wall like firewood, wrapped in stained cloth that has partially rotted away. Others lie scattered on the earthen floor where the cats have dragged them. The corpses are in various stages of decomposition. Some are little more than skeletons with parchment skin. Others are fresh enough that Brennan can see the distinctive features of face and limbs. The cats have been feeding systematically. The smallest bodies show the most damage, their soft tissue almost entirely consumed. Larger infants remain more intact, though gnawed and torn. Brennan's lantern illuminates tiny skulls, impossibly fragile rib cages, limbs no larger than a man's finger. He counts 23 distinct bodies in his first shocked survey. But as his eyes adjust, he realizes there are more. Partial remains, scattered bones, things the cats have dragged into corners. The true number could be 40, 50, perhaps more. Many of the infants appear to have been very young, Newborns are mere weeks old. Others are older, possibly 6 months to a year. This is not a burial ground. There are no coffins, no semblance of consecrated rest. These children have been dumped like refuse and left to the mercy of scavengers. Brennan retreats up the stairs, his hands shaking so violently he nearly drops the lantern. He finds Mrs. Hogan in her office, reviewing paperwork with her characteristic efficiency. When he tells her what he's discovered, her reaction is not horror or surprise, but cold calculation. "Those are medical cadavers," she says calmly. "Stillborn infants donated for anatomical study. The medical college was supposed to collect them last month, but they've been delayed. You had no business in that cellar, Mr. Brennan. It's locked for sanitation purposes." Brennan is a working-class man speaking to a woman of authority. In the social hierarchy of 1838 Dublin, his word carries little weight against hers. But he is also a father of 4 living children, and what he has seen in that cellar cannot be explained away as medical specimens. "Begging your pardon, ma'am," he says, "but medical colleges don't take bodies in such condition, and there's too many for stillbirths. I've worked in hospitals before. I know what proper disposal looks like." Mrs. Hogan's expression hardens. "Your services are no longer required at this institution. You'll collect your wages at the end of the week and not return. Furthermore, if you spread malicious rumors about this hospital's operations, I'll ensure you never work in Dublin again. Do I make myself clear?" Brennan is dismissed, threatened, and paid off. But unlike Mary Doolin or the other dismissed workers before him, Brennan doesn't disappear into Dublin's anonymous poor. He has a brother-in-law who works as a clerk in the constabulary office. That evening, over whiskey in a Liberty's pub, Brennan tells his story. By March 16th, the Dublin Metropolitan Police have obtained a warrant to search the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital. What they find confirms Brennan's account and reveals something even worse. The cellar contains the remains of at least 47 infants, based on skull counts conducted by Dr. Edward Malone, the police surgeon. Some have been there for months, even years, based on the state of decomposition. Chemical analysis of the bones suggests death by starvation in many cases. The marrow cavities are hollow, consistent with prolonged malnutrition. Several of the fresher corpses show signs of disease, the characteristic lesions of typhus, the fluid accumulation of cholera, the pustules of smallpox. But here's what chills the investigators. There are no burial records for most of these children. The hospital's official death register for the previous 2 years lists 41 infant deaths, a number that seemed high but not extraordinarily so given the nature of foundling care. But the cellar contains 47 bodies just in that one location. And when police search the rest of the building, they find more. In a bricked-up coal chute, 6 mummified infants wrapped in newspaper. Behind a false wall in the laundry, 3 more bodies, these so desiccated they weigh almost nothing. In the hospital's small cemetery plot, when the graves are exhumed, 31 infant coffins, but most contain either no body at all or stones wrapped in cloth to approximate an infant's weight. The true death toll at the North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital will never be precisely known, but investigators eventually estimate at least 130 infants died under circumstances ranging from deliberate neglect to what can only be termed murder by omission. And through it all, the cats had been doing what cats do, following the scent of death, finding their way into the charnel house, and feeding on what Victorian society had tried to hide. The scandal breaks across Dublin like a fever. On March 18, 1838, the Dublin Evening Post publishes its first account under the headline, "Horror at Foundling Hospital, Infant Remains Discovered in Cellar." Within days, every newspaper in Ireland and England has picked up the story. The details are too shocking, too visceral to ignore. The image of feral cats feeding on dead babies becomes a symbol of institutional cruelty and social callousness that will resonate throughout the Victorian era. Public outrage demands immediate action. The Board of Guardians, desperate to distance themselves from the scandal, suspends Mrs. Catherine Hogan pending investigation and appoints a special committee to examine the hospital's operations. This committee, composed of physicians, clergymen, and legal experts, begins the grim work of reconstructing what happened. The financial records tell the first part of the story. Mrs. Hogan had been receiving an allowance of 3 shillings per week per child from parish authorities, money intended for food, medicine, heating, and basic care. Her ledgers show these expenditures being made, but the committee discovers something peculiar. The suppliers listed in the ledgers either don't exist or have no record of delivering goods to the hospital in the quantities claimed. Mrs. Hogan had been falsifying records on a systematic scale, pocketing the difference between the allocated funds and the minimal care actually provided. Over 6 years as administrator, she accumulated approximately $2,300, a substantial fortune for a woman of her class, equivalent to roughly 15 years of wages for a skilled tradesman. But the investigation reveals something more disturbing than simple embezzlement. The mortality pattern at the hospital shows a clear progression. In Mrs. Hogan's first year, the death rate was 40%, high but within the tragic norms of foundling care. By her second year it had climbed to 55%. In her final 2 years, it exceeded 70%. What changed? The nurses who agreed to testify, now freed from fear of dismissal, paint a horrific picture. Mrs. Hogan operated on a principle she called natural selection. Infants who were sickly, deformed, or simply weak were systematically given less care than healthier children. Feedings were reduced or eliminated entirely. Sick babies were isolated in cold rooms with minimal heating. When they died, which they inevitably did, their bodies were taken to the cellar rather than properly buried. One nurse, Rebecca Walsh, provides testimony that will become central to the criminal case. Mrs. Hogan told us that every child who died was one less mouth to feed and one less problem for society. She said the weak ones would die anyway, and it was wasteful to spend resources prolonging the inevitable. She called it efficient charity. This philosophy explains the cellar. Proper burial costs money. Coffins must be purchased, gravediggers paid, services conducted. By simply disposing of bodies in the cellar, Mrs. Hogan eliminated these expenses while maintaining the fiction in official records that proper burials had occurred. The cats were an unintended consequence, drawn by the scent of decomposition, but they also served a purpose. They accelerated the decomposition process, reducing bodies to bones more quickly than natural decay alone. The investigation also uncovers the complicity of others. Dr. Richard Moore, the hospital's consulting physician, had visited monthly to certify deaths and provide medical oversight, but his examinations were cursory at best. He signed death certificates for infants he'd never examined, accepted Mrs. Hogan's explanations without question, and collected his fee without conducting proper autopsies or questioning the mortality rate. Several nurses knew about the cellar but said nothing, either from fear of losing their positions or from a learned callousness born of working in institutions where infant death was commonplace. The legal proceedings that follow are complicated by Victorian sensibilities and class politics. Mrs. Catherine Hogan is arrested on March 20, 1838, and charged with manslaughter in the deaths of 12 specific infants. Children whose deaths can be conclusively linked to deliberate neglect based on witness testimony and physical evidence. The charge is manslaughter rather than murder because proving intent to kill is legally difficult. The prosecution argues that Hogan's actions constituted criminal negligence so extreme it crossed into manslaughter. The trial begins in June 1838 at the Dublin Court of Queen's Bench. It attracts enormous public attention. The courtroom is packed daily with observers, and crowds gather outside hoping for details. Newspapers publish daily accounts of testimony, though they sanitize the most disturbing details to protect public decency. Mrs. Hogan's defense attorney, Marcus Sheffield, employs a strategy that reveals the dark pragmatism of the era. He argues that his client is being scapegoated for a systemic problem. Foundling hospitals throughout Britain and Ireland have mortality rates exceeding 50%. The government provides inadequate funding while demanding that institutions accept every abandoned infant. Is Mrs. Hogan truly a criminal, or is she a woman who did her best with insufficient resources in an impossible situation? Sheffield further argues that the children in question would have died anyway. They were sickly, born to destitute mothers, often already ill when admitted. His client may have been harsh, but she was not a murderess. She was simply honest about the grim calculus that all such institutions face: limited resources and unlimited suffering. The prosecution, led by Crown Solicitor James Warren, counters with devastating effect. He calls Dr. Edward Malone to testify about the physical evidence: bones showing marrow starvation, bodies with no signs of disease other than malnutrition, infants who clearly died from deliberate deprivation rather than natural causes. He calls nurses who describe how healthy infants were systematically starved to death over weeks, while Mrs. Hogan pocketed their food allowance. Most powerfully, Warren calls mothers who had placed their children at the hospital. One woman, Margaret Byrne, testifies through tears about leaving her illegitimate daughter at the Foundling Hospital in December 1836, paying a small fee to ensure care, and being told 8 weeks later that the child died of fever. The prosecution proves that Margaret's daughter was one of the bodies found in the cellar, showing no signs of fever but clear evidence of starvation. The jury deliberates for 3 hours. They return a verdict of guilty on 6 counts of manslaughter. Evidence was insufficient for the other 6 charges. The judge, Lord Justice William Burton, delivers a scathing sentence. "You have betrayed the most sacred trust that can be placed in a Christian soul, the care of helpless infants. You transformed an institution of charity into a charnel house of profit. While I cannot sentence you to death for these crimes, I sentence you to 15 years of penal servitude, and I pray that God has more mercy on your soul than you showed to those innocents." Catherine Hogan serves 11 years in Mountjoy Prison, dying there in 1849 during a typhus outbreak. She never expresses remorse. Dr. Richard Moore is struck from the medical register and fined $200 for professional negligence. He leaves Ireland and reportedly works as an unlicensed physician in London until his death in 1853. Several nurses face lesser charges: conspiracy to conceal deaths, providing false testimony. Most receive short prison sentences or fines. The general consensus is that they were accomplices but not masterminds. The Board of Guardians, those wealthy Protestant gentlemen who provided oversight, faces no legal consequences whatsoever. Their defense is simple: they relied on Mrs. Hogan's reports and had no reason to suspect wrongdoing. The investigating committee concludes that while the board showed poor judgment in their oversight, they are not criminally liable. This outcome outrages social reformers, but surprises no one familiar with Victorian class dynamics. The North Dublin Union Foundling Hospital is permanently closed. The building is eventually demolished, though locals report that cats continue to gather on the site for years afterward, as though some scent memory lingers in the ground itself. The surviving children from the hospital, 37 infants who lived through the neglect, are transferred to other institutions or placed with foster families. Follow-up records suggest many suffer from developmental delays and chronic health problems, the lasting legacy of early starvation and trauma. The scandal has one unexpected consequence. It inspires Florence Nightingale, then a young woman of 18, to begin her lifelong interest in institutional reform and nursing standards. She will later cite the Dublin Foundling Hospital case as one of the catalysts for her belief that proper nursing care and administrative oversight can mean the difference between life and death. The Dublin Foundling Hospital case becomes a watershed moment in Victorian social reform, but not in the way one might hope. In the immediate aftermath, Parliament passes the Infant Life Protection Act of 1839, which mandates more rigorous oversight of foundling hospitals and requires quarterly inspections by independent medical examiners. The Act also establishes minimum standards for infant care, requirements for adequate feeding, heating, and medical attention. On paper, these reforms promise to prevent future atrocities. In practice, implementation is sporadic and underfunded. Inspectors are few, institutions are many, and administrators quickly learn to prepare for inspections just as Mrs. Hogan did. The fundamental economic problem remains. Institutions receive fixed payments per child while costs increase with proper care. The financial incentive to cut corners persists. What changes more dramatically is public consciousness. The Dublin case, with its visceral horror of cats feeding on infant corpses, breaks through Victorian sensibilities in a way that statistics and dry reports never could. It forces middle-class and wealthy citizens to confront the reality of what happens to abandoned children in institutional care. Charitable donations to foundling hospitals decline sharply, paradoxically making conditions worse in surviving institutions. While alternative systems begin to receive attention, the case also exposes the deadly intersection of poverty, illegitimacy, and Victorian moral values. Foundling hospitals exist because unmarried mothers face social death if they keep their children, and abortion is both illegal and highly dangerous. The institutions are pressure valves for a social system that punishes female sexuality while providing no real support for the children born outside marriage. Critics began asking uncomfortable questions. Is institutional care truly better than supporting mothers to raise their own children? Does the Victorian obsession with sexual morality inadvertently create the conditions for atrocities like Dublin? Similar cases emerge in the scandal's wake, suggesting Dublin was not an isolated incident but representative of a systemic problem. In 1840, the Birmingham workhouse in England is investigated after neighbors complain about the smell and an unusual number of cats. Authorities find 17 infant corpses improperly disposed of in the building's coal house. The administrator, like Mrs. Hogan, had been embezzling care funds. The case receives less attention than Dublin, perhaps because the numbers are smaller, or perhaps because public outrage has exhausted itself. In 1843, the London Foundling Hospital faces scandal when a former nurse publishes a memoir detailing widespread neglect, though not on the scale of Dublin. Her account describes infants left crying for hours, inadequate feeding, and mortality rates approaching 60%. An investigation leads to administrative changes but no criminal charges. Throughout the 1840s and 1850s, similar stories emerge from institutions across Britain, Ireland, and continental Europe. The pattern is consistent: underfunding, overcrowding, administrators prioritizing cost-cutting over care, and infant mortality rates that would be considered criminal today, but were normalized in Victorian society. The Dublin case also influences literature and social commentary. Charles Dickens, who will publish Oliver Twist just 1 year after the scandal, is reportedly influenced by the Dublin revelations. His depiction of workhouse conditions and the callousness of institutional care echoes the themes exposed at the North Dublin Union. Elizabeth Gaskell's later novels about illegitimacy and infanticide draw on the public discourse that the Dublin case generated. But perhaps the most lasting impact is on how we understand institutional abuse and accountability. The Dublin Foundling Hospital demonstrates several patterns that will repeat throughout history in various institutional settings. First, the vulnerability of populations without advocates. The infants at the hospital couldn't speak for themselves. Their mothers were often powerless and shamed, and authorities were inclined to trust administrators over working-class witnesses. This pattern appears in every institutional abuse scandal, from Victorian workhouses to 20th-century orphanages to modern-day care facilities. Second, the danger of financial incentives that conflict with care standards. When institutions profit from reducing care, abuse becomes economically rational, a perverse logic that transforms negligence into policy. Third, the role of willful blindness. The Board of Guardians didn't want to know what was happening in the cellars. The nurses didn't ask questions. The community rationalized, away warning signs. This collective denial enabled the abuse to continue for years despite mounting evidence. Fourth, the importance of physical evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. The cats forced the issue. They were visible, undeniable, and represented something the public imagination could grasp. Often, institutional abuse only ends when evidence becomes impossible to ignore. In Ireland specifically, the Dublin case feeds into the country's complex relationship with institutional authority. As Ireland moves toward independence in the coming decades, the Foundling Hospital scandal becomes part of a larger narrative about British institutional neglect and the suffering of the Irish poor. The fact that the Board of Guardians were wealthy Protestants overseeing the care of predominantly Catholic children adds a sectarian dimension to the story's memory. The site where the hospital stood, later demolished, becomes a sort of informal memorial. For decades, Dubliners place flowers there on March 14th, the anniversary of discovery. Locals report that cats continue to gather there, though whether this is actual animal behavior or urban legend is impossible to verify. The site is now occupied by modern apartments, but older residents still refer to the area as the Foundling ground. Modern child welfare systems exist in part because of cases like Dublin. The recognition that children need advocates, that institutions require oversight, that care standards must be enforceable. These principles were forged in the aftermath of Victorian scandals. But history also teaches us that institutional abuse doesn't end when laws change. It simply evolves. The fundamental vulnerabilities remain: powerless populations, economic pressures, and the human capacity for rationalized cruelty. The cats of the Dublin Foundling Hospital serve as a dark metaphor. They were simply following their nature, seeking sustenance where they found it. They bore no malice, made no moral choices, felt no guilt. In that sense, they were more innocent than the humans who created the conditions they exploited. The real horror wasn't the cats feeding on the dead. The real horror was a society that created so many dead infants that cats could thrive on their remains. What do you think drove Catherine Hogan to such systematic cruelty? Was she a monster, Or was she simply the product of a system that valued profit over human life? The line between individual evil and institutional failure is never as clear as we'd like it to be. Leave your theories in the comments below. Do you think Victorian society's obsession with moral purity inadvertently created the conditions for tragedies like this? And how do we ensure that modern institutions don't replicate these patterns of abuse? If you found this story disturbing and important, subscribe to Fear Sermon for more forgotten chapters of history that reveal uncomfortable truths about human nature and social systems. We shine light on the stories that history tried to bury, not for shock value, but because remembering these horrors helps us prevent them in the future. Next week, we're exploring another institutional nightmare from Victorian England, one that involves similar neglect but even more disturbing medical experimentation. You won't want to miss it. Ring that notification bell and remember, the darkest chapters of history aren't behind us. They're warnings about what happens when we stop paying attention. See you in the next video.